Today's reading comes from Luke 9:51-62. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. When the disciples James and John saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them. Then he and his disciples went to another village. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, "I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." He said to another man, "Follow me." But he replied, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." Jesus said to him, "Let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God." Still another said, "I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family." Jesus replied, "No one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated.
All right. Hey, good morning, everyone. Hey, many of you know we've actually been in this message series in the Gospel of Luke. And Luke, of course, is a historian who's recounting his eyewitness accounts of the life of Jesus, as well as his teachings. Now, if you're not a Christian here, I just want to say welcome, or if you're exploring faith, what a series to be here with us, because we're actually looking at the words of Jesus and what he said and what he lived and what those closest to him saw and observed around him. So, different than the caricatures that might be out there about the church and about Christians, what is it that Jesus was all about? And that's what we've been investigating. And specifically during the season of Lent, we've been looking at Jesus' journey towards the cross, which again was a historical event where Jesus really died, and then of course to Resurrection Sunday. And so we've been in this series called Step by Step, because we're talking about the different steps that Jesus is taking toward the cross. Now notice, in the passage that was read for us, look at what it says. It says, "As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven." Now, Luke is someone who's, again, he's recounting along with these eyewitnesses about Jesus was on his way to death on the cross. And when he's talking about taken up to heaven, he's talking about the resurrected Jesus. And it says, Jesus resolutely, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. Now, what's significant about a Samaritan village? Well, see, Jews and Samaritans did not intermingle. In fact, they were at odds and even hostile towards one another. So Jews thought that Samaritans were half-breeds who were heretics. They didn't believe the right things. They were unclean people who were not close to the heart of God. And so as a result, they really didn't interact that much. Now, here's the thing. So immediately, if someone's listening to this, they're like, uh-oh, what's going to happen? Something's about to go down. Jesus is going to the Samaritan village? Now, here's the thing. If you've been with us over the last few weeks, you know in the Gospel of Luke in particular, story after story in the Gospel of Luke, is how Jesus' heart actually goes out to those who are seemingly the people who are far from God. So time and time again, you see these stories of Jesus emerge, where God's heart, his disproportionate heart for the poor, the marginalized, those who are distant, time and time again, there's story after story about how Jesus is actually a bridge builder. He's doing incredible work to build bridges. So check this out. Look at what it says. Throughout kind of the Gospel of Luke, look at this list of the various people that Jesus engages with, some of which might echo the sermon series that we've been in. For instance, Levi and the tax collector. Levi was seen as Levi was seen as a traitor. These tax collectors were someone who were in Rome's pocket. They were sellouts who were selling out against the Jewish people. And yet, Jesus actually calls him to be his disciple. There's a centurion, a Roman centurion. And Jesus actually heals on behalf of the Roman centurion's faith. There's a widow in Nain, someone who's got very little social capital, monetary capital, and yet Jesus sees this widow and his heart goes out to her. There's the sinful woman with the alabaster jar, which we preached about a month ago. This idea of, like, even this sinful woman, Jesus commends her for her extravagant faith and the ways in which she entrusts and loves Jesus and has been forgiven. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna. Jesus was someone who consistently uplifted women in a very patriarchal society. Again, do you see how all these stories are these unique stories about how Jesus is actually disproportionately kind, welcoming, and loving to the marginalized? There's a demon-possessed man who people didn't want to be around. There's also the woman with chronic bleeding who is seen as unclean, and yet Jesus heals her and draws close. So do you see what's happening then? You come to this passage, it's like Jesus resolutely sets out for Jerusalem, and he's going to go to a Samaritan village. Like immediately, people are like, wait, what's going on? Jewish person going to Samaritan village? Something's about to go down. But see, when it comes to the arc of the story in the Gospel of Luke, it very much fits with Jesus and who he is. He's a bridge builder. But notice what happens. Look at what happens. It says, he went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was heading for Jerusalem. Now, that moment, right? Wait. It doesn't fit the arc of the narrative of Luke. In the Gospel of Luke, the Samaritans are supposed to be the outsiders who welcome Jesus. Well, what's going on in this story? But actually, that's not what happens. The same flare-ups, the same human divisions that exist, they erupt here, they come out here. And the Samaritans, where everyone would expect, especially in the Gospel of Luke, oh man, the Samaritans, Jesus is going to build some bridges. But he can't. Because they don't want to welcome him. And it doesn't quite fit the narrative that we've been in the Gospel of Luke. Samaritans, who you would think, the Samaritans would definitely welcome Jesus. If no one does, the outsider would welcome. But no, they don't welcome him either. And notice what happens. Check this out. Look at what it says. It says, when the disciples, James and John. So now, it's not the Samaritans, it's James and John, his closest followers. When they saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to destroy them? Guys, these are Jesus' closest followers. Do you see what happened? The Samaritans are basically like, thanks but no thanks. We don't want you here, Jesus. And then his disciples are like, Jesus, hey, we've seen you open the eyes of the blind. We've seen you heal the sick, teach with great authority. You can also call down fire to destroy these people. It's like, I think you've missed the point, James and John. And notice what Jesus has to do. It says that Jesus turned and he rebuked them. He's like, this is not the way or the manner that I've been teaching you. What in the world are you talking about? Then he and his disciples went to another village. Now, do you see the cycle that happened here? The Samaritans reject Jesus. And then his disciples are, what? You reject me? Let's call down fire from heaven on you. Now, a couple weeks ago, I preached this message about how, again, the Gospel of Luke is this amazing portrayal about how Jesus' heart, he has a disproportionate heart for the marginalized, for those on the edges, for the poor, for the outsider. Constantly, we see how Jesus' love and his grace is available to everyone. And we talked about how God's grace, his grace is available to rich and poor, insider and outsider, strong and weak. Jesus' grace is available to everyone. High five your neighbor and say, God's grace is available for everyone. Now, but here's one of the sobering realities, because if God's grace is available for everyone, here's what this passage reveals. It reveals that at the same time, all of us are capable of rejecting Jesus too. And all of us are just as much as we're able to receive God's grace. It doesn't matter if you're a Samaritan or if you're a Jewish person, if you're an insider or an outsider, rich or poor, weak and powerful, outsider and insider. Just as God's grace is available to everyone, the same is true that every single one of us can also reject Jesus and the way of Jesus. I mean, his own disciples are like, Jesus, can we cast down fire from heaven? And Jesus is like, what happened to love and forgiveness? Like, have you guys not been around? Have you not been listening to what I've tried to embody about forgiveness and kindness and love? And they're like, yeah, but these guys rejected you. And it just shows you The patterns of this world, these cycles of violence, are continually perpetrated. Whether you're a Christian or you're not, every human being has the capacity to reject Jesus and the way of Jesus. I remember I was actually a pastor in Queens for many years, and by the end of my tenure at this church in Queens, I was the senior associate pastor, and the founding pastor, his name is Pete Scazzaro. I remember in my last years there, I was kind of like the golden boy number 2 pastor. People would constantly tell me, Drew, you're the most amazing pastor. Hey, Pete should give you an opportunity to preach more. You should definitely, you should probably be leading one day. And I'm like, oh, no. Really, what do you think? So I honestly, I got a little bit inflated about myself. And so in my last year at New Life in particular, we would get into different conflicts. And I was very critical of Pete. I was like, Pete, that's such a poor leadership decision. What are you thinking? And so I would confront him on these things, Even though he was 20 years my elder, I was basically just constantly critiquing him and honestly thinking, Pete, come on, you can lead better. If I were in your shoes, I would do a much better job. Now, I never said that out loud, but I certainly believed it in my heart. And so we end up having all these different conflicts, and a lot of it's because I'm so critical of his leadership. I'm like, I can't believe you made this decision and that decision. So we end up, my wife and I, we end up leaving the church, and that had something to do with it, but not a major thing, but that was just kind of what had been lodged in my heart. Turns out that my wife and I, we then feel called to start a new church. So all of a sudden I'm like, yes, get to start a new church. Get to show Mr. Scazzaro how it's done. And so there's 15 to 20 of us that are starting this church, Hope Church. The original church is in this story. So we start this church, and here I am. I've got an opportunity. And honestly, the first 6 months of starting that church were some of the hardest months of my life. The church was only 15 to 20 people, but I felt like I was failing people left and right. I was so anxious, had sleepless nights, had a hard time making decisions. I would be disappointing people. I was getting a level of criticism. And by the way, it was only 15 to 20 people, and people were criticizing me for decisions that I was making about the pace of how we were going and different things that I said or didn't say. And I just remember that season of being so swallowed up in my own mistakes and being so humbled by how difficult of a time that was. And so I would write a message to Pete, and I would say, Pete, listen, thank you for everything you did for my life. And I just want you to know I'm sorry. This is way harder than I thought it was. And I realized here I was, who had been someone who was so judgmental towards him, thinking that this thing was so easy. And being a lead pastor is so easy. And here I was, lost in some of my own kind of the worst patterns of my behavior of people-pleasing. The worst ways in which I would run ahead too fast, more than people had the stomach for. And here I was making the same kinds of mistakes that I was critical of him for. We're all capable of messing up. We're all capable of missing our way. I had to learn the hard way. What's interesting? If you've ever read or heard or watched The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien, one of the things, the most incredible things about the story of Lord of the Rings is, of course, hobbits are these creatures that are humble and meek. And there's something so beautiful about how these hobbits are the ones who are, in many ways, entrusted to become the heroes of the story. And so, of course, they're on this journey, though, of destroying this ring, which is emblematic of power and the cravenness of the human soul. And there's all these different groups of creatures, right? There's elves and humans and hobbits, and of all these different creatures, there's something so pure about the hobbits that are able to be entrusted with destroying, again, this thing that's a sign for human power and cravenness. Okay, a little bit of a spoiler, okay, so just prepare yourself for this. I'm going to spoil some of Lord of the Rings for you, so if you haven't read it or watched it, I don't know what to say to you. Well, so here's what happens, all right? There's this moment, right, where they've been on this journey, and the journey is to destroy this ring. And so what ends up happening, if you remember, Frodo's on the Mount of Doom. And Frodo, this hobbit, humble, meek hobbit, who is unsullied by the cravenness. And Frodo, he's got the ring. He has the opportunity to just throw it into the mountain, just destroy the ring. And then Samwise comes, and Samwise is his best mate, the guy who's been there with him. Samwise, he goes and he runs, and Frodo's just there, standing on the precipice. And he's like, Frodo, what are you doing? Do you remember this scene? Right? And then here's the image, right? And then Frodo's like, I will not do this deed. The ring is mine. And then he puts the ring on his finger. And then Samwise is like, no! Right? Do you guys remember this scene? Am I the only one here? All right. Thank you. You know what I'm talking about. So, I mean, there's something remarkable about how even Frodo the Hobbit, we're all susceptible. Yes, all of us can receive the grace of God, but all of us are susceptible to rejecting Jesus and his ways. Now, following this, notice what Jesus does. Look at what he says. As they were walking along the road, a man said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. Jesus said, foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Walt preached about this a couple weeks ago, about how sometimes our plans can derail us from following Jesus. But notice what he says. He said to another man, follow me. But this man replied, Lord, first let me go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, let the dead bury their own dead, but you go and proclaim the kingdom of God. Walt talked about how our postponements can keep us from following Jesus wholeheartedly. Now, if this might seem like Jesus is being cold about all these things, like, oh my goodness, Jesus, you're cold about this stuff. I just want you to know, there's so many different areas where Jesus talks about loving your family and making good plans and things like that. But he's trying to accentuate a point which we're about to get to. Notice it says, still another said, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go back and say goodbye to my family. Right? And look at how Jesus replies, no one who puts a hand to the plow and looks back is fit for service in the kingdom of God. Jesus basically saying, not only your plans, not only your postponements, not only your past, which Walt gave a brilliant message over. And here's essentially what Jesus is doing. Right? Jesus is saying, don't care about your family, don't care about your plans, don't care about your past. No. There are other scriptures where Jesus consistently talks about the value of family, consistently talks about making plans, and the wisdom literature is full of this idea of making plans. Then what's Jesus doing? Why is he speaking with such hyperbole here? Especially after this moment where even his followers are perpetuating cycles of violence. What is Jesus doing here? Jesus, essentially what he's saying is, it is so hard to follow Jesus wholeheartedly. Like, this is difficult. What Jesus is calling us to, it seems nearly impossible. But what he's inviting us to the kind of life. Because what's in us, the culture that's in us in our city, the culture that's in us in the world, where there's wars and the cycles of violence that occur, even in current events, the way that their cycles of violence continue to be perpetuated, sometimes even in the name of religion and God. And I just want you to know, Jesus is basically saying, listen, you've got it all wrong. All these cycles, I just want you to know, it is so hard to follow me. Heck, even my closest disciples are calling down fire from heaven. And that has never been my message. And what is Jesus doing? He's basically talking about, listen, what it means to follow Jesus. It involves like all of who you are. A wholehearted surrender to God. But it's difficult to do that. Your plans, your postponements, your past, all these things get in the way. Which again leads me to a question of like, oh my goodness, this sounds so difficult. How in the world are we supposed to do this? Now here's what's crazy. Because again, when it comes to these cycles of violence, Jesus actually offers another teaching that comes later in the book of Luke. Look at what it says. Luke chapter 10. It says, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. And he said, teacher. So he's an expert in the law. So he's a religious professional. Like me. Anyhow, but he says, teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And notice he says, what is written in the law? He replied, how do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind. And Love your neighbor as yourself. And notice what he says. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. I mean, isn't this beautiful? Again, when Jesus, he's talking to this expert in the law. Now, there's other passages that echo Jesus teaching this. It's generally called the Great Commandment. In other words, what sums up life with God? What sums up the Christian faith? If there's anything that sums it up. Now, most people today, secular society, say, what sums up the Christian faith? It's hypocrisy, judgmentalism, being right all the time, and perpetrating violence. No. Listen, I just want you to know. From the words of Jesus, what sums up the Christian faith? It's loving God. It's love. It's loving God and loving your neighbor as yourself. That's what sums up the Christian faith. Now notice when it comes to this idea of wholeheartedly following Jesus, loving God and loving your neighbor. We call this an integrated view of discipleship. It's both of these things. But here's what happens. Oftentimes it's easy to bifurcate these two things and to actually do one without the other. For instance, and we just finished a marriage investment weekend a couple weeks ago. I could be someone who studies and preaches wonderful sermons and knows a lot about the scriptures and spends copious amounts of time in prayer before God. And I feel so filled up with love for God whenever I'm in my office and I'm studying and praying. And my wife could be in the living room and feel so alone in our marriage. And here's what Jesus is saying. Listen, you can't separate the two. You can't say you love God and yet your wife feels unloved. Now, do you see how explosive this is? And do you see how, especially religious professionals, how difficult this can be? Especially those maybe who've grown up in religious settings, how difficult it must be. How do you integrate both of these things? How can you be someone who loves God but also loves your neighbor? Now, notice what happens in this story, though. Because Jesus, if you think about like all the visions for what is the good life, what is the virtuous life. Now, here's what Jesus does. As he teaches on this integrated view of love, look at what he says. The expert, the religious leader, he says he wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Listen, he's trying to get Jesus in this gotcha moment. And notice what Jesus does. And see how brilliant Jesus is. He says, in reply, Jesus said this. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now, this path from Jerusalem to Jericho is a very common path that was rife with all sorts of dangers and robbers and things like that. Now, notice what happens. When he was attacked by robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And notice the story. Very common occurrence on this road. You've seen that road. You know what could happen to someone who's not vigilant about their surroundings. This man is beaten and laid for half dead. And notice what happens. It says a priest, a religious professional, happened to be going down the same road. When he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Now, immediately, the expert in the law who's hearing this, it's an affront. It's like, oh my goodness, are you calling me out? You trying to call me out right now, Jesus? Now, that's not what it said in the text, but I could imagine the feeling of like, what? The priest, he goes by on the other side of the road. Now, notice what happens though. So too, a Levite. Now, some of you might be wondering, what is a Levite? Well, all priests were from the Levite tribes, but not all Levites were priests. Levite, though, that tribe was meant to support the priestly function. So Levites were those who were still associated with the temple, but they weren't necessarily priests. So do you see what's happening? There's like levels to this. First, it's a priest. A priest misses this person who's been left on the road, beaten. But then also a Levite, someone who might not be a priest, but is elevated in this extraordinary way. When he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. Now, here's what's happening, right? So Jesus is telling this story. He's like, a priest, then a Levite. Now, here's what's happening. The listener's probably like, I see what Jesus is doing here. He's saying, see, these religious professionals, they might know the law, but they're going to miss it. They're missing out on how to love someone. So the next person naturally in the story, you go from priest to Levite, now we're going to go to an Israelite. Just a common person who goes to the synagogue. Nope. But a Samaritan. What? A Samaritan? As he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Now, a couple things to note here about the Samaritan. Again, it's so different though. It's like, what, a Samaritan? That's the enemy! A Samaritan is a person. Now, listen, you don't even have to have known this parable. You probably have heard the phrase Good Samaritan before. This is where it comes from. It comes from the wisdom of Jesus, who talks about an uncommon kind of love and kindness. A way of compassion and caring for those who are different. Now notice, Jesus is teaching this teaching on the wake of having been rejected by the Samaritans. He's teaching this teaching in the wake of his own disciples who are like, you want us to call down fire from heaven? And Jesus is giving this different kind of moral vision. He's like, basically, listen, the ways of the world is constant violence towards one another. I want to show you a different way, a way of love. And as he does this, he gives his teaching about the Good Samaritan. Now notice this about the Good Samaritan, though. The Good Samaritan, even in this story, it's not like the Good Samaritan's like, let me give my life savings over to this person. Why don't you move into my home and live here as long as you want? There's still limits and boundaries to what the Good Samaritan will do and not do for this person who's been beaten up and bleeding. In other words, Jesus isn't saying all of us are called to, in this incredibly unwise way, to lay down everything. He's just talking about being loving to someone in need. One of the organizations that we love to support is this organization called Do for One, which Andrew and Allie, they're the founders. They're there. They're right there in the back. Do for One is an organization that creates friendships and community amongst those with physical and mental disabilities, as well as those who may not have some of those same challenges, but have other challenges in life. And these friendships are built, and Do for One, the organization, comes from this phrase, do for one what you wish you could do for everyone. You don't have to save the whole world. You don't have to be Jesus in that regard. But each one of us can do for one what we wish we could do for everyone. And the Good Samaritan gives us such an incredible map. This story is a story of love. Now, look at what Jesus says. He says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. Now, do you see what Jesus is doing here? Like, Jesus is saying, listen, any one of us, we can reject Jesus. Any one of us is prone. Whether you're an expert in the law or whether you're just exploring faith for the first time, anyone can reject Jesus. But if you want a vision for what a life with God is like, it's a life with loving God and loving your neighbor in this profound, incredible way. But I don't know if it's like this for you. I know for me, when I read this parable, I'm like, this is really hard. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Like, how in the world are we supposed to do this? It's hard enough to take care of myself. You're talking about loving a neighbor who might be different than me and in need? How in the world? Listen, maybe if you're a parent here and you're just like, I'm trying to keep just a little infant alive right now. Like, how in the world am I supposed to do this for people outside of that? And the reality is, every single teaching of Jesus is supposed to provoke us to say, this is really hard. How in the world are we supposed to do this? In fact, it's easier just to fall into the same patterns of the world. Patterns of violence. Patterns of rejecting Jesus. Patterns of rejecting and even calling down fire from heaven on our enemies. But to live this vision, who in the world can do this? You know what's amazing? It's time after time. Jesus gives us an incredible vision for life. that is just so different than the ways of the world. And you know what else is crazy? Is people, including his closest followers, keep failing. They keep messing up. And it's understandable, right? Because who in the world could actually live this out? And what's most stunning about the Jesus story is that Jesus ultimately, he ends up going to the cross. And as he's dying on a cross, he says these words: Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Jesus, he dies on the cross for the very people who fail time and time again. And even then, when Jesus really could say, bring down fire from heaven, he hangs on a cross. He says, Father, would you forgive them? They don't know what they're doing. They've lost their way. Now that is extraordinary. And that is the heart of the Christian message. Alcoholics Anonymous has this phrase: I can't, he can. I think I'll let it. You know, this incredible moral vision that Jesus offers of love, of God, of others, being a good Samaritan, stopping these cycles of violence, of rejecting the world's ways. The reality is, friends, each one of us, no matter how long you've been a Christian here, no matter if you're a religious professional or not, every single one of us, we all have the capacity to reject Jesus. And the question for you and for me is today, will you just be able to surrender and confess and say, God, I can't. You can. I think I'll let you. And begin to surrender our pride, our self-righteousness, all the ways in which you and I, when it comes to the ways that we've been trying to live our lives, and there's these areas in our lives when it comes to a fully integrated life, there are areas of our lives that we haven't fully surrendered to God. We haven't fully said, God, I can't, you can. And the question for you and for me and for all of us today is, today will you surrender? Will you say, God, I want to stop rejecting you in these areas of my life? And I want to follow you wholeheartedly. And I want to give you my career. I want to give you my ambitions. I want to give you my relationships. I want to give you my private life. I want to give you my hands, my heart, my head, my eyes. I want to give you everything. I can. He can. I think I'll let him.